main challenge with silicon as the substrate for photovoltaics is that silicon is an indirect bandgap material. So that means we need a lot of material to absorb a sufficient amount of sunlight, sufficient amount of photons to create the power we want from the solar cells. So we need a lot of material. We need much more than for thin film solar cells, for example, that are made from direct semiconductors. So a typical silicon solar cell is about 180 microns thick. So that's actually much thicker than a typical thin film solar cell, only being a few microns or even less. That also means we have to pay a price when it comes to energy. And the story there is that because the cell is thick, when we generate an electron hole pair within the bulk of the material, it needs to, on average, travel a long way compared to in a thin film cell to reach the metal contacts that are typically on the front and the back in order to be collected. And because of that, the quality of the material needs to be really high in order for the charge carriers not to just recombine. So this is a very important balance in all silicon solar cells, the balance between recombination and the lifetime of the charge carriers. And in order to optimize the cells in this regard, we need the highest possible quality of the material. The challenge of that is that typically costs a lot of money in the production. So the highest efficiency silicon cells are made from monocrystalline, single crystalline silicon, typically made from the Sokalsky method, where a cylindrical ingot is grown from a monocrystalline seed. That means we only have one crystal, so all the crystal planes are aligned within this material. We don't have any grain boundaries, and that means we minimize the recombination in the bulk. But this is an expensive way because of producing silicon wafers themselves, because we need to grow this ingot in a very clean environment, and we need to have a silicon melt, a molten silicon, where we draw this ingot from, and that's typically quite expensive. And it's more expensive compared to the multicrystalline silicon cells that are cast in a mold. So when we do that, we get grains of different crystal orientation, which gives recombination at the grain boundaries, but it is a cheaper way of manufacturing the wafers and therefore also the cells. So we have these two main categories of silicon cells, one being slightly more expensive to produce and slightly more efficient, and one being slightly cheaper and slightly less efficient. And the only reason that they're both still in the market today, multicrystalline represent about 70% of the global market and monocrystalline about 25%, is that their price in terms of dollar per kilowatt hour is almost the same, roughly. And if it weren't so, probably one of them would have gone out of the market already. If we look at the problem or the challenge with silicon as an indirect bandgap material, it has to do with the absorption of photons, and that absorption is wavelength dependent. So short wavelengths are very energetic, and they're being absorbed very close to the top surface, or the surface where the photons are incoming. You could also put it in another way, that a very thin cell would be able to absorb short wavelengths, but when it comes to the longer wavelengths that are less energetic, it takes more material. It takes a thicker wafer to absorb these longer wavelengths. So if we look at the solar spectrum, the infrared and the near infrared part of the spectrum is actually very important to optimize the output of solar cells, and therefore the red and infrared wavelengths are difficult for silicon solar cells to absorb and to get the full potential out of. In order to solve this, a lot is being done in silicon solar cells, besides having a sufficiently thick wafer, which doesn't solve everything, because we can't pay an infinite price of just going to thicker wafers. What is being done instead is to try to achieve what's called light trapping. So we basically ensure that the photons that are not absorbed within an absorption length of equivalent to the thickness of the wafer, that they bounce back and forth a couple of times until they are absorbed. So in order to ensure this, we need the photons to be reflected back when they reach the back surface of the solar cell, and preferably being reflected back and forth between the rear and the top surface within the bulk of the material until it is being absorbed. This requires that we make a good mirror on the back side of the cell. That could just be metal, but it could also be an oxide layer or dielectric layer with a metal on the back, and we could also structure the rear of the cell. So all these things are measures in order to trap the light and enhance the absorption of infrared wavelengths. If we look at the efficiencies of silicon solar cell, which is of course very important in terms of the output of power that we're all interested in, the theoretical maximum called the Shockley-Quisser limit for silicon solar cells is around 29%. And this is limited by the band gap of the material. You can basically calculate that if you assume that we absorb all the photons that we can with this material, and we use all of this photon energy to create electrical energy, and we collect all of that energy, all of those electrons, we can get that theoretical efficiency. So that's assuming a lot of perfect scenarios, ideal scenarios, and of course it's very, very challenging to reach that in practice. But actually, silicon solar cells are becoming, are approaching, the efficiency of silicon cells are approaching this theoretical limit. The current record for monocrystalline cells that are the most efficient is 26.3%. So if you look at that cell, it doesn't lose a lot when it comes to neither optical or electrical losses. So basically, a silicon solar cell is one big balance between optical and electrical losses. And typically, if you optimize one of the things, it comes in on behalf of another parameter. As an example, if you want a completely non-reflecting surface, you can texture the top surface of silicon in various ways. And I've worked a lot with nanostructures where we can actually texture the cell to be completely black. That means the reflection is zero, essentially zero across the whole solar spectrum. That's of course nice, and it's a very interesting feature with these nanostructures. But when you do that, and if you do nothing else, you've also electrically completely ruined your surface. You've created a much larger surface area with a lot of dangling bonds, and that means a lot of surface recombination. So you enhance the optical properties and you degrade the electrical properties. So we have to do something in addition to that. So if we look at what's been done and what's left to achieve the theoretically maximum possible efficiency of silicon solar cells, what's left is both some optical and some electrical losses that are still present. So even the record solar cells today still have some reflection. Actually, most, even the best monocrystalline cells, if you look at them and if you measure the reflectance, they still reflect a lot of the blue and ultraviolet light. And this is what we attempt to solve with the black silicon nanostructures that makes this reflection actually go away. But in order for that to result in a record efficiency, you also need to passivate the surface really, really well in order not to just lose the electrons that are being, the excess electrons that are being generated from this excess absorption. A lot is also being done on the rear of the cell in order to achieve perfect light trapping. This is challenging because it's quite easy to get some effect. If you make a mirror on the rear, you will see photons with long wavelength bounce back and forth. But in order to make all the available wavelengths be trapped or bounce back and forth sufficient amount of time to actually be collected, to generate charge carriers that are then being collected, requires a very, very high quality material. It also requires a perfect light trapping scheme, which is sometimes hard to realize, even though we know in theory what should be done. And we should also preferably make the cell even thinner, to increase the collection probability and thereby increase the voltage and the current of the cell. So there are still a few things to be done to really raise this efficiency. When we now talk about making cells thinner, as I said before, there's actually potential gain in the efficiency to be reached here. There's also a reduction in price, of course. The smaller amount of silicon we can get away with using and still create the high efficiency, the cheaper the production, at least when it comes to raw material usage. But there are some practical limitations that when we get below, say, 100 micrometer thickness, silicon wafers become very hard to handle in an industrial production. Remember, we need to produce thousands of 6-inch silicon cells per hour to get the economies of scale that the silicon industry produce today. So these wafers must be handled very fast, very controlled. That involves robotic arms moving the wafers. It involves large boats and cassettes going into furnaces and different clean room environment. And when silicon becomes thinner than, say, 100 micrometer, roughly, it starts acting like a foil and it starts becoming quite fragile. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it starts to become practically challenging, besides the theoretical considerations of having an optimal thickness. There are a lot of measures actually being put into producing thin silicon wafers, and with that I don't mean thin film silicon as in a few hundred nanometers grown amorphous silicon layer, but I actually also refer to monocrystalline silicon wafers being grown or being produced at a thickness of, say, 50 micrometers, on that order. That's very attractive because that thickness is just enough to get the ideal optical properties if you have perfect light trapping, good texturing, and so on. And it's ideal electrically in order to collect the charge carriers being produced. What's not so ideal, or what's challenging, is how do we produce volumes equivalent to the silicon solar industry today with those thin wafers. So there are a couple of companies and also research activities going into how do we do that. Should we grow a wafer epitaxially from silicon? Should we make wafer production a bit like the multicrystalline production, where we grow, where we cast the wafers in a mold? So instead of growing an ingot that we cut out, maybe we cast each wafer. That would probably make it multicrystalline, but if we make it high quality, then we don't lose anything from sawing the wafers. So that's actually a big topic. How do we avoid the kerf loss in sawing out wafers? So going to thinner silicon cells is a big topic in order to reduce the price. To answer the question of how do we go from the 26.3% record we have now for monocrystalline and up to the theoretical limit, we need to suppress the last piece of reflection that these cells still have. We need to optimize light trapping of long wavelengths. We need even higher material quality so that the bulk lifetime increases. And we need to do whatever we can to passivate the front and rear surface. Passivation really comes down to how can we get away with passivating the whole surface the best way possible while still having electrical contacts that collect the current. And if you look at the record cell from Kaneka, it excels in that the technology is able to create a heterojunction with a very good passivation and collect the current from these surfaces without ruining that passivation. So that's an important point that should be improved even further if we want to reach the theoretical maximum. When we look at multicrystalline cells, that have a record around 22%. Those cells, in addition to all the factors just mentioned for the monocrystalline, have the challenge of the grain boundaries. At the grain boundaries, we have an increased risk of recombination of the charge carriers. So these grain boundaries must be, preferably minimized in the production, but that's hard if you still want to keep the cheap production method of the multicrystalline wafers. These grain boundaries must be passivated. So there's a lot of work going into passivating grain boundaries in multicrystalline material. For example, using hydrogen passivation, where you could incorporate a lot of hydrogen in, say, the anti-reflective coating. Typically, that's a hydrogenated silicon nitride. And then if you, in the production of the cell, of the silicon cell, heat treat it appropriately, you could incorporate or diffuse a lot of hydrogen. By looking at the different hydrogen species, even make that hydrogen go to the grain boundaries and passivate it. And then you suddenly create a really high quality multicrystalline material that's cheap in production, but that actually have the qualities to reach these above 20% efficiencies. So that's very important. A lot of work is also being put into, even at industrial scale, to making what's called PERC cells. And this is inspired by the PERC and Pearl technologies, where you passivate the surfaces also on the rear and make local contacts instead of putting a metal on the whole rear, which is the sort of industrial standard. You actually only make local contacts, and that means you have an almost perfectly passivated rear surface, and you only have direct contact between metal and silicon where you need to in order to extract the current. So taking that passivated rear technology from the lab and to the industry is a really important step towards high efficiency multicrystalline, and I think that's a way to really push industrial mass produced cells to very high efficiencies. If we then look at an electrically optimized multicrystalline cell and say, what can we do to push that further? If it's still blue, when you look at it on the roof, it reflects blue light that could be used in the cell, especially if the front surface is well passivated, so short wavelengths can be useful when you look at the quantum efficiency. So there are novel texturing techniques like black silicon that I'm working with could be relevant for multicrystalline cells at an industrial scale. Again, you have to optimize the electrical properties with one hand and the optical properties with the other hand in order to really push the efficiency.